Hello my friends, this is Baal Kadmon, and I would like to thank you for watching and or listening to this podcast. So the other day someone asked me about a series of texts I talk about in some of my books called the Targums or the Targumim. In my books I just say that they are Aramaic translations and interpretations of the Old Testament, but I don't go much deeper than that. But there is more to them, and I will address some of that here in this podcast. Jews for several hundred years didn't really speak Hebrew as we know it today, but Aramaic. Hebrew was relegated mostly to religious study and scholarship. I guess you could say it's not dissimilar to some Ashkenazi communities around the world today that don't speak Hebrew but speak Yiddish and only reserve Hebrew for Bible study. So why Aramaic? In around 586 BC, when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, many Jews were exiled to Babylon, and they really had no choice but to learn Aramaic since that's what was spoken there. In fact, many became very much assimilated into the Babylonian culture and even intermarried, and some completely forgot their Hebrew, but many, of course, did not. As it states in Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 23 through 24, it says, "Moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of one of the other peoples, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah." The exile lasted only about 50 years. Many Jews stayed behind and some returned to Israel. Aramaic was used right through the decline of Alexander the Great's empire and the resurgence of the Persian one, which made Aramaic the lingua franca of the region. So what does Targum mean? Targum means translation at its core, but it can also mean interpretation. So although they are meant to be translations, they do a lot of interpreting. In fact, they add a lot of detail that does not exist in the Old Testament, even though they are written in the same style as the Old Testament. For example, Genesis 1:1 is Genesis 1:1 in the Targums as well, even if they add stuff to it. The earliest of the Targumim can be found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are a few of them, but the ones I will show examples for are from the three major ones. It's Targum Onkelos, the one I studied as a child, Targum pseudo-jonathan, or the Jerusalem Targum, and the Targum Neophiti. I won't go into depth as to their respective histories, but I just want to illustrate how they differ from not only from one another, but from the original Old Testament text and what they add. So I'm going to give two examples for each Targum. Let us discuss Targum Onkelos first. This one was the one I grew up reading because my father had sent me off to a dreadful religious school as a child, a school I eventually was expelled from. We won't get into that here. It's mainly a translation of the first 5 books of Moses, and it is relatively tight in its translation. Its origin is in question and a bit beyond the scope of this podcast. Let's see how it differs from the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible. So this is the plan. We will look at the Hebrew, translate it into English, and then look at the Aramaic and translate that into English. This will give you a good idea of how different it can be. Let's start with Genesis 1:1. In Hebrew it's Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In English, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. In Aramaic, in the Onkelos translation, it says, Bakadmin bara Adonai yat shamaya ve'yat ar'a. In English, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The translation is pretty much the same, but do you hear the language difference? In the beginning in Hebrew is Bereshit. In Aramaic, it's Bakadmin. The word kadmon and kadmin are from the same root. The word for earth in Hebrew is aretz. In Aramaic, it's ar'a. Very different. Now let us look at Targum pseudo-jonathan, or the Jerusalem Targum, for this same verse. And I will just repeat myself in the English and the Hebrew to make this easier to contrast. Hebrew again. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. English, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. In Aramaic of pseudo-jonathan, it states, Bereshit bechokma bara Adonai. In English, in wisdom the Lord created. As you see, it frames the entire first line differently and describes the act of creation to have originated from God's wisdom. So so even though it's Genesis 1:1, it has completely different wording and a different context. It actually gives you a little bit more depth. Now let's look at Targum Neofiti as it pertains to Genesis 1:1. In Hebrew, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In English, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. In the Aramaic of Targum Neofiti, it states, Melakadmin bechokmata bara de Adonai shachlel ushachlel yat shamaya ve'yat ar'a. English, from the beginning, and in great wisdom, God created and finished the heavens and the earth. So as you can see, it differs quite a bit. It already states that God created and finished the heavens and the earth, unlike the other translations that do not have this language. Now let's go through another verse, and I'll show you how they differ. Each Targum differs. This one should be a little bit more interesting. I'm sure you're familiar with Enoch, the one who walked with God, and he was referenced in the book of Genesis, and he is of the book of Enoch fame. In the Old Testament, we don't know much about him. We just know that he was 365 years old, and then God took him. We don't know what that means. If we just look at the surface text, it doesn't mean anything really. Let us look at this now, not only in Hebrew, but in the Aramaic Targumim, and you will see how they've added additional information regarding Enoch. Genesis chapter 5, verse 24. Hitalech Chanoch et haElohim ve'enenu ki lakach oto Elohim. In English, Enoch walked faithfully with God, and then he was no more because God took him away. Now let's look at the Targum Onkelos with the same verse. V'halich Chanoch betachlata de Adonai, v'laitohi are lo amit yateh. And Enoch walked in the fear of the Lord, and he was not, for the Lord had not made him to die. So here we have additional information. We have here that something that Genesis does not say, and where Genesis just says he went with God, whereas here it says he also went with God, but just to be sure, he didn't actually die. God just took him up alive. Now let's see how Targum pseudo-jonathan, or the Jerusalem Targum, translates this verse. And this is really interesting, this one. Ufalach Chanoch bekushata, kadam Adonai veha, lehitohi im dairei ar'a arum, itnagid vesalik, lerakia, bemeimar kadam Adonai, ukara shamia mitatron, safra rabah. And Enoch served in the truth before the Lord, and behold, he was not with the sojourners of the earth, for he was withdrawn, and he ascended to the firmament by the word before the Lord, and his name was called Metatron, the great Safra. Now that is interesting, isn't it? Here we have a lot more information as to what happened to Enoch when he was quote-unquote no more, and he is now associated with Metatron after he ascended into the heavens. That's quite a bit more information. And finally, let's look at how this verse is translated in the Targum Neofiti. Ufalach Chanoch bekusheta kodam Adonai v'liyat yedia einhu itnaged b'mimar kodam Hashem. And Enoch served in truth before the Lord, and it is not known where he is, because he was withdrawn by a command from before the Lord. This makes me laugh a little bit when it says, and it is not known where he is. I don't know why that tickles me. So anyway, as you can see, the Targums are not just translations. They would be awful if they were, but they are also interpretations of the verses. Of course, if you were not familiar with the Torah and you just saw the Targums, if that was the only thing you saw, you would think that that was the Torah because it's structured the same way. Genesis 1:1 is Genesis 1:1 in the Torah and in all the other Targums. So if you didn't know the Torah and you just saw, Targum Neophiti, and you would read it and you would think that's what the Torah actually says, which is very interesting. And the Targums in general are very interesting because they give us an idea of how those who wrote and compiled these texts were explaining verses in the Torah to the people of the time. Clearly, those verses needed to be interpreted because on their own, it doesn't make sense. I mean, if you read again in the Genesis where, Enoch suddenly is taken by God, I'm sure people are wondering, where did he go? And of course, if we read the book of Enoch, we know where he went. But if you read the Targumim, especially the Targum Jonathan, you see what happened to him, which is very much in line with the book of Enoch. Which, by the way, it's actually Hanoch. I don't know why we all call it Enoch. I mean, I still do it as well in English, but it's actually Hanoch. There's no E in the beginning. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. And before I end this, I just want to give you an update. I have 2 books in pre-release right now. The Beelzebub, A History, which will be out any day now, actually. And the other one on the Antichrist, which it says it's slated to be out in May, but it's going to be out much sooner. And I think you're really going to like that one because there's a lot of history there from all sorts of vantage points. And no, there are no rituals. Someone actually texted me the other day asking if I'm going to include rituals in the book to call on the hordes of the Antichrist. And no, unfortunately, I'm not. But I think you will really like the history. Anyway, that's all for tonight. I hope you are all well. I will speak to you soon. So mote it be.